Well, let's move on now. And something that also has been rather breathtaking over the last year has been the Liberal Party. And now stalwarts John Howard and Peter Costello have come out and given a rather grim warning about what the future involves unless the party gets its act together. Howard said the dramatic loss of seats in metropolitan Australia at the last two elections is either cyclical or it's existential, but that will be determined at the next election. And I think that's right, Hollie. There is this sense now that the Liberal Party's seat count is so low. Mm-hmm. They're getting 25% of the primary vote nationally in the polls at the moment. They're facing dual threats from Labor and the Teals on the left, but then also now from an aggressive One Nation on the right. And they really have, unfortunately, struggled to define themselves this year. And it really is hard to see how they get through this.
Well, as a former member of the party, I can tell you I have a look now, and I was a staffer in the Howard Costello days, and I remember who the MPs and senators were then. And a lot of them had come from a small business background. They had owned businesses. They had actually paid people's wages. They knew what it was like to have to pay the bills and still try and keep a business operating. And now I look at who is going into Parliament and the party. It's the party of think tanks and management consultants, not one of the people that, I'm sure someone will send me a very nasty text message and point out to me someone who does come from a strong small business background. But honestly, I'm really stretched to try and think of someone who's coming from that background. A lot of them have had experiences as lobbyists, as consultants, management consultants, as think tank, experts, having had no world experience, but have certainly the ability to write an essay, so therefore an expert on everything, and come from these sort of think tanks. And they just don't have any real understanding. And even if you think of John Howard, he came from a small law firm before he went into politics. He had that background in a sort of a suburban law practice, didn't come out of a top tier law firm. He was actually coming from a firm that was on the ground with people in a very different environment. And I think that's where the Liberal Party's lost its way, because they don't talk about industrial relations reform. I mean, we've got a hospitality business now, and I can tell you, paying award wages, I have actually some sympathy for people that underpay, because our staff change rates halfway through a shift, because after a certain point you get paid differently. And I can promise you, looking around that party room now, there isn't anyone that would probably really understand that. And until they get back talking to those small business owners, that's where the mortgage belt was. That was the Howard battlers. They were the people that stood up and said, this is my government and I support them because they understand me and the challenges I have facing my family. And now you've got people, coming at you from McKinsey telling you, if you listen to me, I'll tell you how to run your life. Not that I've ever run one myself.
Look, I think the real question here is existential or cyclical.
It's not cyclical anymore.
Now, the very fact that he's using the word existential means it is existential. So how do the Liberal... And to be honest, the fact he's saying it to the Australian, I'm very surprised that he's not just having those discussions within the party, and that there is not the succession planning that we see going on in other industries. We all know that the election was abominable, but there were easy wins. There still are easy wins. Education. Parents in this country are completely defeated by the fact that our education results are appalling. The New Zealand Conservative Party went into their election up against Labor with a mandate on election. That was their number one policy, because it affects all stratas of society. It affects regional, it affects urban. They won that election, and they have turned around back to basics teaching, as have the UK. Now, if we do not focus on portfolios like education, housing, if the Liberal Party can't focus on those, when yes, they're not easy issues, but they require sustained attention and they require ideas and imagination. But putting the ideas and imagination and pulling the electorate together, you are not going to win back those teal seats unless you appeal to the masses. So yes, fiscal responsibility, industrial relations, taxation, but some of those social health and education and housing, I think, are critical.
Well, you talk about imagination, and that's a very good point, because I think if you're going to be successful as a party, you need to actually have a vision for our nation, and you need to have conviction in that vision. I think a big problem at the last election was what was the vision? Save 25 cents a litre? That's not exactly compelling. And if we're going to devolve into a politics of handouts, well, Labor will always win because they will always be willing to spend more money. So I agree. I think the party really has to sort its stuff out, but get back to those issues that do affect everyone, that do affect small businesses, that do affect the families that are trying to balance the budgets around the dinner table, because people are struggling out there.
And people don't watch the news like they used to. They're not watching the 6 o'clock news every night and getting that update. Of course, those of you that are sensible enough to be watching us tonight, I'm sure you are very well across the brief and the issues. But for a lot of families, just staying up to date is really difficult. And so you have to be able to ensure that you are hitting them where it's actually not necessarily hurting them, but certainly having an impact on their life.